The beam from the flashlight cut through absolute darkness, revealing something that shouldn't exist. There, 50 feet below the forest floor, sat a train that hadn't been recorded in any historical document, a ghost from an era when fortunes were carved from stone and secrets died in the deep. The two brothers stood motionless, their breath forming clouds in the cold underground air, staring at a discovery that would rewrite everything they thought they knew about the abandoned mines beneath their grandfather's property. Jake and Marcus Brennan had grown up hearing stories about the old mining operations that had once thrived in these mountains. Their grandfather had worked these tunnels in his youth, back when the veins of silver and copper still promised prosperity to anyone willing to descend into the earth's depths. But the old man had always been vague about certain details, his eyes growing distant whenever questions turned to why operations had ceased so suddenly in 1897, why entire sections of the network had been sealed without explanation, and why certain families in town had accumulated wealth that seemed disproportionate to the documented mining yields. The brothers had returned to their grandfather's land to settle his estate after his passing 6 months earlier. Among his belongings, they'd found hand-drawn maps that didn't match any official mining records, passages and chambers marked with symbols they didn't recognize, warnings written in his careful handwriting about areas to avoid, and cryptic notes about unfinished business in the depths. Jake, the older brother by 3 years, worked as a geological surveyor and possessed both the equipment and expertise to explore underground spaces safely. Marcus, a documentary filmmaker, saw the potential for capturing something extraordinary on camera. Neither anticipated what they would find. Their first 3 expeditions into the known tunnel system revealed nothing unusual. Standard mining infrastructure, collapsed passages that matched historical records, and evidence that scavengers had long since stripped anything of value from the accessible areas. But on their 4th descent, following a route marked on one of their grandfather's more obscure maps, they discovered something that shouldn't have been possible, a passage sealed with stones and timber that bore none of the weathering patterns of century-old construction. The seal had been built from inside the tunnel, not outside. Someone had closed this passage from within and never emerged. The realization sent ice through their veins, but curiosity proved stronger than caution. Working carefully over several hours, they removed enough stones to create an opening, and the air that rushed out carried smells that hadn't existed in these tunnels for generations: oil, old wood, and something metallic and sharp that made their teeth ache. Beyond the seal, they found themselves in a section of the mine that appeared on none of the official maps. The tunnel descended at a steeper angle than regulation safety standards would have permitted, the walls showing evidence of hasty excavation rather than the careful engineering visible elsewhere in the network. Support timbers sagged under decades of pressure, and their footsteps echoed in ways that suggested vast empty spaces ahead. Marcus filmed everything, his camera's light dancing across walls that gleamed with mineral deposits in colors that seemed almost deliberately decorative, veins of green malachite, blue azurite, and golden pyrite forming patterns that could almost pass for intentional artistry. They walked for nearly 40 minutes, descending what Jake estimated to be an additional 100 feet below the main tunnel system, when the passage opened into a chamber that took their breath away. The space stretched beyond their light's reach, the ceiling lost in darkness above them, and there, tilted at a 15-degree angle across the chamber floor, sat the train. It wasn't large, just a locomotive engine and 3 cars, the type used for hauling or within the mine network rather than to the surface. But its mere existence raised impossible questions. How had it gotten this deep when no rails connected this chamber to the known network? Why had someone sealed the only apparent entrance from within? And why had this entire operation been hidden from official records? The locomotive tilted nose down into a collapse that had occurred after its arrival. The floor had given way beneath its weight, sending the front half of the engine crashing into what appeared to be a natural cavern below. The 3 cars behind it had derailed in the chaos, their wheels torn from the twisted rails, their contents scattered across the chamber floor in a trail of debris that disappeared into the shadows. Jake approached the wreckage with professional caution, testing each step before committing his weight, acutely aware that the floor had already failed once in this chamber. The locomotive's metal body bore the marks of extreme heat, not from explosion or fire, but from something more gradual, as if it had been subjected to intense temperature over an extended period. paint had bubbled and peeled, metal had warped in places, and the iron showed patterns of oxidation that suggested exposure to conditions far different from the cool, stable environment of the rest of the mine. Marcus filmed while Jake conducted his examination, narrating their observations in a whisper that seemed appropriate for the cathedral-like silence of the space. The first car they examined had carried tools and equipment. Picks, hammers, drilling apparatus of a design Marcus didn't recognize, all of it scattered when the car overturned. But it was the second car that made them realize this discovery transcended simple historical interest. The wooden crates that had spilled from the second car bore markings they initially couldn't decipher, symbols that combined elements of mining claim stamps with what looked like private commercial codes. Jake, his hands shaking slightly, used his multi-tool to carefully pry open one of the intact crates. Inside, wrapped in layers of oilcloth that had protected them from a century of moisture, lay gold bars stamped with a mark neither brother recognized. Not the standardized stamps used by government mints or legitimate mining operations, but something private and unofficial. They opened 6 more crates, each containing the same cargo, gold bars of consistent size and purity, their weight suggesting processing techniques more sophisticated than the crude smelting operations that had been standard in the region during the 1890s. But more intriguing than the gold itself was what they found mixed among the crates: leather-bound ledgers, their pages filled with handwriting in multiple languages, recording transactions and names that would later prove to span continents and involve figures whose descendants still wielded considerable influence in modern financial circles. The third car presented an even more complex puzzle. Unlike the first two, it had been locked. The heavy padlock still held, its mechanism frozen with rust but its fundamental security intact. Jake had to use a portable angle grinder from their equipment pack to cut through the lock's hasp, the screech of metal on metal echoing through the chamber in a way that felt like violation of something sacred. Inside the third car, they found not gold but paper. Thousands of documents sealed in waterproof containers, certificates that appeared to represent ownership claims to mines, properties, and commercial ventures across 3 continents, legal papers transferring assets in ways that contemporary law would have considered questionable at best, and photographs of people whose faces Marcus would later research and discover in historical archives associated with some of the era's most notorious financial scandals. Jake, drawing on his knowledge of mining history, began to piece together what they were seeing. The 1890s had been a period of intense speculation in mining operations, with legitimate enterprises existing side by side with elaborate frauds designed to separate investors from their capital. But what they had found went beyond simple fraud. This appeared to be evidence of a systematic operation to extract and hide wealth from multiple mining operations, to forge ownership documents, and to create a network of false claims that could be traded and sold to unsuspecting investors while the real wealth disappeared into private hands. The brothers spent hours documenting everything they found, Marcus filming while Jake carefully catalogued and photographed each item. The gold alone represented millions in contemporary value, but the historical significance of the documents might prove even more valuable. These papers could potentially unravel ownership claims that had been considered settled for over a century, could reveal fraud that had enriched families whose descendants still benefited from wealth built on these deceptions, and could provide answers to historical mysteries that researchers had long considered unsolvable. As they worked, they began finding more troubling evidence. Personal effects scattered through the wreckage told stories of the men who had brought this train to its final resting place. Pocket watches stopped at the same time, suggesting simultaneous deaths, tools arranged in ways that implied preparation for work that was never completed, and most disturbing, what appeared to be defensive fortifications built into the chamber's entrance tunnel, as if those inside had been expecting someone to try breaking through. Jake made a discovery that shifted their understanding of events. Near the locomotive, partially buried under debris, he found a journal that had belonged to the train's engineer. The leather cover had protected the pages inside, and though some entries were illegible from water damage, enough remained to tell a harrowing story. The engineer had been part of a crew tasked with moving the cargo to a secure location, but not by his company's owners. Instead, a group of workers and mid-level managers had discovered the frauds being perpetrated by the mine's ownership, had realized that when the schemes collapsed the working men would be left with nothing while the architects of the fraud disappeared with the real wealth. So they had staged their own operation, working over several weeks to excavate this deep tunnel, to lay rails in secret, and to systematically redirect a portion of the concealed wealth for their own purposes. But something had gone wrong. The journal's final entries spoke of betrayal within their own ranks, of someone alerting the mine's owners, of armed men entering the main tunnels to hunt them down. The crew had retreated to this deep chamber, had sealed the entrance, and had apparently died here. Whether from lack of air, from violence, or from some other cause, the journal didn't specify. The engineer's final entry, written in increasingly unsteady handwriting, expressed not regret for the theft but fury at the injustice that had forced their hand, and hope that someday the truth would emerge and the men who had built fortunes on the backs of workers while leaving them with nothing would face accountability. Marcus and Jake stood in silence after reading these passages, the weight of history settling on them like the millions of tons of rock above their heads. They were standing at the site of both a heist and a tragedy, where men had tried to claim what they felt was owed to them and had paid with their lives, where a fortune in gold and incriminating evidence had sat in darkness for over 100 years waiting for someone to find it. But their discovery raised immediate questions about what to do next. The gold alone would make them wealthy beyond anything they'd imagined, but it came with complications. Did it belong to them by right of discovery on their grandfather's property, or could descendants of the original mining company make claims? More troubling, what about the documents? Publishing the information contained in those ledgers would expose frauds that had been buried by time, would potentially challenge property rights and inheritances that had been considered legitimate for generations, and would certainly make them enemies of powerful families. They decided to document everything thoroughly before making any decisions about what to report or reveal. Over the next week, they made multiple trips to the chamber, each time bringing better equipment, more storage for photographs and scans of documents, and increasingly sophisticated measuring tools to map the space and catalog every aspect of the find. During one of these expeditions, Jake made a discovery that reframed everything they thought they understood. While examining the walls of the chamber, he found what appeared to be a natural tunnel leading away from the space, not a mining excavation but a geological feature that the miners had discovered. Following this passage for several hundred feet, they emerged into a vast natural cavern system that extended for miles beneath the mountain. Here, the brothers found evidence that the stolen train represented only a fraction of what had been hidden. The natural caverns had been used to store additional materials. More crates of gold, additional documents, and most remarkably, equipment and samples that suggested the fraudulent mining operations had been even more extensive than the train's cargo indicated. Some of the materials suggested connections to international smuggling operations, to political corruption at the highest levels of territorial government before statehood, and to financial manipulations that had affected markets and economies across the developing American West. The brothers also found evidence of what had killed the men who'd brought the train here. In one of the natural caverns, they discovered the remains of a collapse that had occurred shortly after the entrance was sealed, not where they'd entered, but in another passage that appeared to have been an emergency exit. The men had been trapped not by their own sealing of the entrance, but by geological bad luck that had closed their escape route and left them entombed with their prize. Among the remains, treated with the respect due to the dead, they found more journals and personal effects that told stories of ordinary men driven to extraordinary actions by desperation and a sense of injustice. These were not criminals in any conventional sense. They were workers who had seen their labor enriching others through fraudulent means and had decided to take direct action rather than accept exploitation. The morality of their choice remained ambiguous, but their humanity was evident in every artifact, every personal item that spoke of families they'd hoped to provide for, dreams they'd held for better futures. As the brothers continued their exploration, they began to understand why their grandfather had never revealed what he knew. Among the names in the ledgers and documents, they found his father's signature. Their great-grandfather had been part of the crew that had moved the train, had been one of the men who had sealed themselves in this chamber. He had survived only because he'd been on the other side of the collapse when it occurred, and he had spent the rest of his life carrying the secret of what had happened, of where the gold remained hidden, and of the choice his compatriots had made. Their grandfather had inherited this knowledge, but not the treasure. The entrances he'd known had been truly sealed, the passages genuinely blocked by time and geology. He had left maps not as treasure guides but as historical records, hoping that someday someone with the resources and expertise to reach the site safely might find it and understand the full story of what had occurred. The cryptic warnings in his notes weren't about physical dangers but about the ethical complexity of what they would find. Wealth that came with a burden of history, truth that carried the weight of injustice. The brothers faced a decision that would define their futures. They could take the gold, sell it quietly through channels that wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions about provenance, and become wealthy while leaving the historical record unchanged. They could report everything to authorities and likely lose any claim to the treasure while ensuring the truth became public knowledge. Or they could attempt something more nuanced, securing their financial interest in the gold while also ensuring the historical significance of the documents reached researchers and historians who could properly contextualize these revelations. After days of discussion and debate, Jake and Marcus chose a middle path. They documented everything in meticulous detail, creating digital archives that could never be fully suppressed, and then they selectively began to reveal their discovery. They started with academic historians, providing copies of documents and photographs that proved the existence of the fraud network without initially disclosing the location or the presence of gold. These revelations alone created waves in historical circles, forcing reassessment of long-accepted narratives about mining operations and wealth accumulation in the American West during the crucial period of territorial development. The academic publications brought attention from unexpected quarters, descendants of families mentioned in the documents, legal experts debating property rights and treasure trove law, and geological societies interested in how the natural cavern system intersected with human mining operations. The brothers navigated this attention carefully, revealing information incrementally while working with legal experts to establish their claim to whatever wealth the site contained. The gold itself remained in the chamber for months while legal processes unfolded. Jake and Marcus had learned enough from the documents to understand that wealth without clear title brought nothing but trouble. They worked with local authorities, with historical societies, and with legal counsel to establish a framework for claiming the gold while ensuring the site's historical significance was protected and properly studied. During this process, they discovered that several of the mines and properties mentioned in the fraudulent documents were still in operation under ownership that traced back through shell companies and complex transactions to the original fraud network. The revelations they were slowly releasing had already begun affecting property values and inheritance claims, creating exactly the kind of legal chaos they had anticipated. Some of the affected parties approached them with offers, substantial sums to keep certain documents private, threats of litigation if specific information became public, and in one case, a poorly veiled suggestion that their health might suffer if they continued making trouble for established families. These pressures only strengthened the brothers' resolve to see the truth fully revealed. They realized that their grandfather and great-grandfather had never had the resources or connections to fight against entrenched power, but Jake and Marcus lived in an era where information could be distributed globally before anyone could suppress it, where documentary evidence could be preserved in ways that made it impossible to erase, and where public interest in historical injustice could create momentum for truth-telling that private wealth couldn't easily counter. Marcus released his documentary about the discovery in carefully controlled segments, each release timed to maximize impact and public interest while protecting their legal position. The footage of the train itself, the shots of gold bars spilling from century-old crates, and the slow revelation of what the documents proved created a sensation that extended far beyond academic circles. The story captured public imagination. It had all the elements of great narrative: hidden treasure, historical injustice, ordinary people taking extraordinary action, and modern-day discoverers forced to navigate complex ethical territory. The attention brought additional discoveries. Other families came forward with stories passed down through generations, whispers of relatives who had disappeared while working in the mines, suggestions that the crew of the sealed train might have been more numerous than the remains they'd found suggested, and leads about other sealed chambers that might exist elsewhere in the network. Each new revelation added layers to the story, transforming their initial discovery from a single dramatic find into evidence of systematic operations that had lasted for years. Jake continued his geological and archaeological work at the site, now with proper permits and in collaboration with university researchers. The natural cavern system proved even more extensive than initial exploration had suggested, containing evidence of human activity that predated the mining operations by centuries. Native American artifacts suggesting the caverns had been known and used long before European arrival, challenging assumptions about what indigenous peoples in the region had known about mineral resources and underground spaces. After 18 months of legal processes, documentation, and negotiation, the courts finally ruled on ownership of the gold. The decision split the wealth three ways: 1/3 to Jake and Marcus as discoverers on their own property, 1/3 to a fund established for descendants of the original workers who had been defrauded by the mining company, and 1/3 to the state for historical preservation and further research into the site and the broader pattern of mining fraud it represented. The brothers' share still made them wealthy, though not as fabulously rich as they might have been if they'd simply taken everything in secret. But the framework of the settlement felt more honest than pure acquisition, more aligned with the values their grandfather had tried to instill in them through the careful way he'd preserved information about what lay beneath the mountain. The Historical Settlement Fund proved more complex to administer than anyone anticipated. Tracing descendants of workers from operations over a century past required extensive genealogical research and created debates about who qualified for inclusion. But the fund's existence acknowledged something important: that the wealth originally built through fraud had rippled across generations, and attempting to address that injustice, however imperfectly, mattered more than leaving it unacknowledged. The site itself became a protected historical location, with the train and its contents preserved in place as a unique artifact of American industrial history. The chamber was carefully stabilized and made safe for researcher access, though it would never be open to general tourism. The descent was too technical, the spaces too fragile, and the respect due to the site as a tomb demanded restriction. But detailed documentation and Marcus's documentary footage allowed the public to experience the discovery vicariously, to understand what had been found and what it meant. Jake and Marcus used their portion of the wealth to fund additional research into mining history, to support organizations working to preserve industrial archaeology, and to create educational programs about the complex relationship between labor, capital, and justice in American economic development. They also established a research center on their grandfather's property, creating a place where scholars could study the documents and artifacts from the find while also examining the broader context of mining operations in the region. In the third year after their discovery, researchers working in the archives they'd established made a connection that had eluded everyone else. Some of the names in the fraudulent mining documents matched names appearing in financial records related to early railroad development in the region. Further investigation revealed that the fraud network had been even more extensive than anyone realized. The fake mining claims had been used as collateral for loans that funded legitimate business ventures, meaning that some of the region's most respected institutions had been built partly on foundations of fraud that stretched back to the sealed train and the men who tried to hold someone accountable. This revelation created exactly the kind of reckoning the brothers had both hoped for and dreaded. Institutions were forced to examine their own histories, families to confront uncomfortable truths about their legacies, and the broader public to grapple with questions about how historical injustice continues to shape present-day inequality. Not everyone appreciated this reckoning. Jake and Marcus received their share of criticism from those who felt they'd opened wounds that should remain closed, that questioning long-settled property rights created more problems than it solved, that some truths were better left buried in the dark. But they also received validation from unexpected sources. Labor historians recognized the significance of the find for understanding worker responses to exploitation. Legal scholars debated the case in journals, examining how property rights should be weighted against historical justice. And descendants of the original workers, some of whom had grown up hearing fragmentary stories that they'd never been able to verify, expressed gratitude that their ancestors' actions and fates were finally known and acknowledged. The story of the lost train and its cargo ultimately became less about the gold itself than about what the discovery represented. It was evidence that historical truth could emerge from darkness after more than a century, that ordinary people could take extraordinary action against injustice even when those actions carried terrible costs, that complexity and moral ambiguity characterized most of human history rather than simple narratives of good and evil, and that modern discoverers of such truths bore responsibility for how they handled what they found. Jake and Marcus never forgot what their great-grandfather and his companions had sacrificed in that sealed chamber. The choices those men made, to steal wealth they believed they were owed, to seal themselves away from pursuit, to die there with their prize rather than surrender it, remained morally complex even with full knowledge of the fraud that had driven them to such extremes. But the brothers understood that their own choices mattered just as much. They could have taken the easy path to wealth, could have left the documents buried and the truth untold, could have avoided the complications that came with shining light on historical darkness. Instead, they chose to honor both their grandfather's careful preservation of information and their great-grandfather's sacrifice by ensuring the full truth became known. The wealth they gained was real but secondary to the satisfaction of knowing they'd contributed something meaningful to historical understanding, that they'd helped address injustices that had been buried for generations, and that they'd navigated complex ethical territory without losing sight of what mattered most. Years after their initial discovery, with the legal battles mostly settled and the research center thriving, the brothers sometimes returned to the chamber where they'd found the train. They would stand in the carefully lit space, now safe and stabilized but still carrying the weight of history, and consider how a weekend exploration had transformed into something that consumed years of their lives and changed how they understood their own family's past. The derailed train remained where it had crashed, now preserved behind barriers that protected it while allowing researchers to study its every detail. The gold that had spilled from overturned cars had been removed, catalogued, and distributed according to the court's ruling, but the train itself and the chamber that held it remained as testament to everything that had occurred. The fraud, the retaliation, the entombment, the century of silence, and finally the revelation that brought truth into light. The cargo of that train had indeed been worth millions, but its true value transcended simple monetary worth. It represented a moment when ordinary people refused to accept exploitation without resistance, when truth proved more resilient than those who tried to bury it, and when modern discoverers chose ethical complexity over easy profit. The lost tunnel had yielded its secrets, and those secrets had proven more valuable than gold alone could ever be. Before we close this incredible story, if you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who appreciates deep dives into extraordinary discoveries. Hit that subscribe button and consider supporting with a super thanks. It helps us keep bringing you these remarkable stories from history's hidden corners. And we're curious, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. We love knowing our community of history enthusiasts spans the globe, and who knows? Maybe your region has similar mysteries waiting to be uncovered. This is exactly the kind of content we're passionate about creating, and your support makes all the difference in allowing us to research and present these stories with the depth they deserve. Until the next discovery, keep exploring, keep questioning, and remember that truth has a way of emerging from even the deepest darkness.